Welcome to the studio visit conversation with artist Xu Weixin, the first webinar event of the new series WebinART, which introduces arts and artists of contemporary China. This program is co-organized by the University of Michigan's Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies and the University of Michigan Museum of Art. My name is Natsu Oyobe. I'm the curator of Asian art at University of Michigan Museum of Art. I will facilitate today's program and moderate questions and answers at the end. So let me introduce today's speakers. Artist Xu Weixin was born in Yihui in Shanxi province in 1958 and now lives and works in Beijing and New York. He received a BA from Sheng Academy of Arts and an MFA from Beijing Academy of Arts. He's currently a professor of painting and the former executive dean of the School of Arts at Renmin University, Beijing. His works have been exhibited and collected by public institutions and private collectors in China and worldwide. The first panelist, Dr. Angie Baecker, a Ph.D. in 2020, very fresh, from the Department of Asian Language and Cultures at the University of Michigan. She is currently a lecturer in the Department of Art History at the University of Hong Kong. Her research focuses on the cultural history of the PRC, and her dissertation investigates representations of labor during the Maoist period. She has published widely on contemporary art and has edited monographs for artists including Yang Fudong, Zhang Wan, and Ai Weiwei. Angie is joining us from Hong Kong this morning, so thank you for getting up so early, Angie. The second panelist, Dr. Lihong is Sally Michelson-Davidson Assistant Professor of Chinese Arts and Cultures in the Department of Art at the University of Michigan. She specializes in Chinese art history of the Ming and Qing. Her research focuses on time, matter, space, and motion in art, especially with regard to arts environment engagement. Dr. Liu earned her PhD in the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She taught at the University of Rochester until recently. She joined the University of Michigan faculty this fall. So she's one of the newest members of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies community. So welcome, Lihong. And today's interpretation provided by Sheng, PhD candidate in the Asian Language and Cultures Department at the University of Michigan. So let me introduce artist Xu Weixin. So Xu Weixin has combined his interest in universal human conditions with a stark realist style that is deeply rooted in China's modern art history. His recent works are single-person portrait series whose subjects share the same historic time or environment, merging personal and collective narratives. In 2016, the University of Michigan Museum of Art presented selected works from his two acclaimed series, Chinese Historical Figures 1966 to 1976, and minor portraits in the exhibition Xu Weixin, Monumental Portraits. The large-size portraits of Chinese citizens whose lives were affected by a large force of history and societal shift arose an incredible sense of empathy and connectedness among the visitors. In the last 5 years, Xu Weixin has been working on the series titled Chinese Historical Figures 1978 to 2018 and painted over 70 portraits of celebrities, politicians, and people appeared in news media. As a whole, it reflects the tectonic shift in the Chinese society in the past 40 years. He recently had an exhibition of selected works from the series, but these 6 portraits, these 3 and the next 3, were censored and not able to be shown. because the subjects were those who challenged the state authority or were in incidents that tainted the power of the authority, such as Liu Jijun, the former minister of the Ministry of Railways, who established the high-speed railway system, but later arrested for corruption. So now, let's switch to artist Xu Weixin waiting for us in his studio in Brooklyn, New York. Professor Xu and Yihui, please unmute and start the studio tour.
徐老师，您可以把自己取消静音。
取消了。
对，现在您可以带我们去参观一下您的这个工作室。
OK。
Your studio. Thank you.
好，谢谢大家，谢谢夏子，谢谢 Carol， 谢谢各位。我现在先参观一下这个我的这个工作室，这是一个旧的一个办公室，大概4500尺改装的一个工作室。因为我的作品比较大，所以那个就需要一个稍微大一点的空间。那我先看一看这儿吧。首先是
徐老师，我可以翻译吗？
你可以。
So thank you everyone. Thank you Natsu and Carol and Neil for organizing this event. Today I would like to show all of you my studio. 好，您请继续。
我今天这个不是一个展览，就是我的作品这个画室里的作品呢，有各个时期的都有，有最新的，也有几十年前的作品。
So this is not an exhibition, but a collection of all of my works that many of my works. Some of them are done many years ago. Some of them are done recently. 好。
最早呢，我是画一些大概30年前，我也画一些西藏的作品，比方说这些。
So 30 years ago, I painted something about Tibet, for example, like this.
后来画一些矿工。就改成肖像了，
Later, I started to work on portraits and also portraits of miners in particular.
还有一些农民的肖像。
And also portraits of peasants.
最后转变成了就是这个历史中国众生相，就是用这个肖像呢，就是反映中国的近现代史，比方说文革历史。这都是上次展览看的，你翻译。
And then later on, I developed my entire work into using portraits to depict or delineate the history of contemporary or modern China. So what I just showed are a series of portraits that can reflect the economic and all kinds of historical moments and economic developments in China.
最后一套大型的这个历史作品，就是刚才夏子已经介绍了，就是改革开放40年，在人民大学展出了，只展了20几张，实际上一共有70多张。
改革开放20年是吗
？40年，1978到2018。
好。So one of the most recent like big project that I had worked on was this anniversary, sort of an anniversary exhibition for the 40-year anniversary of the economic reform in China. That's what Natsu had also just mentioned previously.
然后我去年到这个工作室改装完以后，就在这里还画了一些新的，就是比方说这个矿工肖像就是比较新的作品，是用过去的那个图像。但是呢，是加了全部的文字在这个画面上。这个文字的内容就是，比方说2005年或者06年整个那个时期的矿井事故的记录。
Okay, so another thing is that sorry for my lighting. So what I have done later is what I'm showing here. By using some works that I had painted before, for example, such as this portrait of this miner, and then add text onto the portrait. And all these tags are the records of the mining accidents happened in like 2005 and 2006 that sort of showed and give an additional meaning to the original painting that was painted before I added these tags.
还有一个今年年初呢，就是不幸的是这个有病毒，武汉首先发现了这个virus 这个病毒，新冠病毒。然后呢，这个当时非常有影响的一个医生叫李文亮，这个故事大家都知道，所以我呢就给他画了一张，先画一张小的，我准备将来画一张巨幅的。这个也是用了新的方法，一个是这个2段颜色，上面是黑白，下面是彩色的，还有就是写了全部的它的这个事情的过程。翻译一下。
So this is another recent work of a portrait of Dr. Li Wenliang, who is known as one of the first people or the whistleblower in China who reported the COVID-19 to reach out to the public in general. And this again, I added text onto this portrait, and the text tells the entire story of the COVID-19 and of Dr. Li Wenliang. And I plan to, this is currently not a very big painting, so I plan to expand it to a larger scale. I also employed new methods of in this painting by using two colors and divide the canvas into 2 parts, and also add text to the portrait.
这个病毒不幸的就是在全世界那个肆意流行、肆虐，然后我呢就是想用肖像呢先做一个记录，就是我准备就是把这些我可能将来也许有一个计划，就是把这个重要的这个疫情相关的事件，看看将来能不能组成一个系列的肖像人物，我还是在考虑。
So because this virus has been a global pandemic and it's impacting all the human beings in this world, I'm envisioning to use portraits to record this event and maybe develop them into a bigger project in the future, that a project about the COVID-19.
然后我呢最新的一个实验就是我画了一些抽象的作品，就是这个呢是我最新的，就是想因为我画了一辈子的具象写实的，我现在准备我又画了一些新的这个各种材料综合材料的抽象作品。这个虽然过去对世界美术史来讲这个非常老，但是对我个人来讲，我想探索一下我个人的这个潜力。
So these are the paintings that represent the sort of new experiments I'm working on. So I adapted a new style, namely the abstract style, and these works are sort of my abstract works. Previously, I had been working on realistic paintings to portrait, for example, like portraits of figures. Now I would like to try something new, and also using all kinds of materials not confined to oil, but all kinds of new materials to paint those works. Although this sort of experiments look sort of outdated to the world or in the entire art history field or art field, this is actually quite new to me, and it's an opportunity for me to challenge myself and explore my other capabilities.
因为我喜欢试验各种各样的样式，对我来讲，可能它这样的试验会产生新的可能性。因为如果一成不变的话呢，它就是固定的，我觉得就可能将来发展的可能性就会变窄。
Because I like to sort of experiment with all kinds of new styles and materials, and just play with all the stuff so that I can come up with some new ideas and expand my future works.
我再给看一下这个抽象作品，我的时间也差不多了，好像。
您有总共有20分钟。
现在有多长时间了？
现在好像 How long does he still have? Do you know, Natsu?
You have about 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes? 您还有10分钟。
还有10分钟，好。然后这个是我的也是另外一个抽象作品，但是我还挺喜欢这一张的，但是看着简单，但是也是制作了很长时间，也是用各种各样的材料。
So this is another work of like abstract work that I actually really personally like a lot. Although it looks quite simple, actually I used all kinds of materials to paint these 2 colors on the canvas, and it took me a long time to complete this piece.
它不是油画，它就完全是各种各样的材料，就是在大部分是用建筑啊和化工的各种材料试验。这个工作这个角落是我画肖像的这个一个工作环境，这个角落是画肖像的角落，然后待会儿我再给大家看一下画抽象的这个地方。
好的。So this is the where I paint. I work on portraits. This is the space I work on portraits. Later on, I will show you the place I work on abstract pieces.
对，然后这是我的工作的台，我给大家看一看，我画抽象作品是在一个因为抽象作品很脏，我就在这个地方画。
So that was my workbench of portraits or realistic works, and here it's my working place for abstract works, because abstract works can be sort of messy. So I use a garage to paint them.
对，这是一个比较大的车库，非常脏。这个地面我已经清洁过1次了。这是我的各种绘画材料。
So it's sort of quite messy here. It's converted from a garage, and I've actually cleaned up the floor a little bit, but it still looks a little sort of disorganized.
另外，我有很多的工具，也是平时做画框啊什么的，我都是自己动手的。大家可以看看。
So all these are the materials that I sort of work on, or the utensils that I use when painting the works, and it also includes some frames. I also made them by myself to frame my work, my pieces.
好像还有5分钟，那我再给大家介绍，看看其他的几个肖像哈。这2个肖像给大家介绍一下，就是这有一对儿叫农民的肖像，这个肖像呢也是2005年画的，已经过去了10几年。当时有一个展览叫农民，我的心目中的农民，我觉得他们是为这个中国经济做了很多贡献，但是他们本身还是很受伤，所以我选了一个有这个眼睛上有伤的一个农民画了一个肖像。我画了一个彩色的，一个黑白的，这样的话对比起来，做了一个就是2张肖像放起来是一个作品。
So this pair of portraits is actually one work. They are the work of their portrait of a peasant. It was painted. This entire work was painted in 2005 and showed in an exhibition titled "Peasants." Although, in my opinion, although peasants, they contribute a lot to the economic development in China, they were also injured a lot, hurt a lot, and somehow become invisible in the society. So I chose to paint an injured peasant in my work to demonstrate what I was thinking, or what I think about, what the image of peasant is in my mind through my work. So this is
那个时候我的那个创作观念就是，对底层对这些工人农民的一种同情吧。
So I feel quite empathetic with the peasants and also the peasant workers who had very low social status back then in China, and I used this contrast of colored and black and white portrait and technique to show this sort of a contrast between their own status, their contribution and their own status to the society.
现在这边这个女的肖像是那个一个也是那个改革开放40年，其实那个还没有画完，就是其中的一个人物还没完成。改革开放40年的。
董明珠是吧？
董明珠对，没画完。
So this is a work that I'm working on. It's the figure here is a female businesswoman in China. She is called Dong Mingzhu and is also the chairwoman in Gree Electric. It was this piece is one of the many portraits in this exhibition for the 40-year anniversary of economic reform.
因为这个改革开放肖像，我并不是只画了那些有名的商人，因为当然这个改革开放40年，中国在经济方面取得了很大的成就，所以商人也选了一些，比方说马化腾啊，这些马云啊都在这边。那其实我还画了很多其他的，这个今天没有时间讲了，大家有空的话可以在这个网上可以看看我画的这70个人当中有改革开放这几十年中最有代表性的各个阶层、各个领域里的人物。
So in my work, in that work for the 40-year anniversary of economic reform, I painted about 70 people. Many of them are businessmen and women, but I also painted people from other classes and other occupations, so that to demonstrate how they contribute or impact the economic reform so how they were impacted by the economic reform in China. If you are interested, go to my website.
对，这个是上次密西根大学展览的海报，所以我把它都收藏起来了。另外还有一个你翻译吧。
These were are the posters that I had that I had for my last exhibition at U of M. So I just collected them and framed them.
这个是我那个在2011年在那个哈佛大学费正清研究中心做了一个展览，叫《流通中的肖像》，这是他们的海报。这个也是我也画了一些这个钞票上的肖像，一些人物。但那个展览不是一个纯粹的一个艺术展，但是也还是算的一个活动，比较有意思。
So this is another exhibition I had at Harvard, and it's about 流通中的钞票是吗？
流通中的肖像。
流通中的肖像。
对。
The portraits in exchange. It's the title of the exhibition is named.
对。那我时间差不多了，我就先介绍这些吧。
So I think that's about the time. So I think that's all I want.
谢谢大家，谢谢你翻译。
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Xu and Yihui, for great translation. So I'm sure audience have some questions, and I want to remind you that if you have a question, just go to Q&A icon and type your question, and we'll try to answer as many as questions at the end. I'd like to move on to the second part of the event. So now I'd like to invite two panelists and who will give short presentation. Angie, please unmute and start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Natsu. And thank you also to Xu Weixin for so generously allowing us to come inside his studio today. I think one of the silver linings of the kind of collective quarantine experience has been the fact that artists' studio visits are now opened up on online platforms. So the studio visit, it's kind of an important ritual that people in the art world, like collectors, curators, and artists engage in, but it's not often open to the public. And so I think it's really wonderful that now wider audiences are getting to experience that. And one of the reasons that I like studio visits so much is because you really get a chance to see the artist's working process and the conditions under which a work was made, which is something that's not always apparent when you are seeing like a finished gallery ready piece of art. So in my remarks today, what I wanted to do was to just make a really small attempt to kind of sketch in very large and brief strokes the trajectory of Xu's career. So as Natsu said earlier, he was born in Urumqi in Xinjiang in 1958, and he belongs to a generation of artists whose lives have been very intimately shaped by the vagaries of Maoist history. So he was 8 years old when the Cultural Revolution began, and when he was 17, he was a sent-down youth, or an intellectual youth stationed on the Sanping farm in the western suburbs of Urumqi. In 1978, college entrance exams were reinstated after many years of not being held during the Cultural Revolution, and Xu took them in an extremely competitive class. He tested into the Xi'an Academy of Fine Arts, which was no small accomplishment at that time, and left behind the manual labor of the farm for a bachelor's degree in art pedagogy. He graduated in the early 1980s, and after graduation, he held a couple of different post-graduation stints back in Urumqi. He worked in foreign trade and cultural programming, and then in 1987, he returned to school, and he enrolled in the oil painting department at China's, one of two premier art academies. It was then called the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Art in Hangzhou, but it's now known as the China Academy of Art. So both the Xi'an Academy of Fine Arts and the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts were very important centers of artistic experimentation during the '85 New Wave in China. That was a movement that witnessed a really exuberant proliferation of artistic and cultural activity across the nation. There were all these histories and theories of art, literature, music, culture, and they were all being translated and distributed within China and very widely circulated along a bunch of kind of like, hipster kids or urban youth. And artists in particular really gobbled these up. They would rip through kind of just like decades of cultural development outside China in a way that maybe mirrors kind of the way that we binge streaming entertainment today. So the genre of contemporary Chinese art traces its origins to this period, and particularly to the artists of the avant-garde and the underground, who often had experimental or even dissident art practices that sometimes put them at odds with official institutions. So I have just a few slides here to go through. Okay. So at this time, Xu was a student in the oil painting department. So he wasn't really at the oculus of the '85 New Wave movement, but rather he negotiated these changing tides from within a much more conservative discipline of academy oil painting. His training really emphasized realist painting techniques, even as the truth claim of the canvas was deeply contested at that time. Academic oil painting departments were still very heavily influenced by the legacy of Soviet-style socialist realist painting techniques, which had been elevated as the official academic style in the first decades of the PRC. But after the end of the Cultural Revolution, the political traditions that academic oil painting was very closely associated with were called into question, and the field really struggled to redefine itself during this time. The genre's response in the 1980s and 90s was to reach further into China's folk and minority histories for subject matter. And so Xu's painting from this time reflect those interests, such as his mid-90s series of paintings from Tibet, particularly Lhasa. So since the mid-90s, Xu's interests as well as the contemporary art canon have decisively shifted, of course. But even as Xu has turned his attention away from folk culture and ethnic minorities, portraiture remains a very dominant genre in which Xu practices. He frequently paints portraits of manual workers, such as coal miners and migrant workers, and that interest speaks to the abiding influence of his time working as a manual laborer himself. He's perhaps best known for a series of paintings that depict what he called Chinese historical figures. And within this series, he has several different collections, including intellectuals from the Republican period, major figures from China's economic reforms, as he's mentioned, as well as participants in the Cultural Revolution. So the academic realist style in which Xu has trained has given way to a style that the critic Wang Ling calls documentary realism as a response to socialist realism. And in many ways, Xu is still wielding the same realist painting skills of his training, but the generic conventions of socialist realism have been traded for a much more quotidian monochromatic sense of photorealism, something similar to what you see in works by Li Songsong, Chuck Close, or Gerard Richter. The scale of Xu's portraits conveys a sense of monumentality. So he typically, as we saw, paints on really huge canvases, They typically are 2 meters wide and 2.5 meters tall, which really dwarf kind of anyone who walks into the space and interacts with them. And Xu makes sometimes austere stylistic choices, putting things in black and white. And these often convey a sense of solemnity, of stillness, and even spectrality. Perhaps Xu's most well-known body of work is his series of portraits from the Cultural Revolution, several of which were exhibited at UMMA in 2016. So here is one work that the museum's collected of the writer Beijing. And each portrait in this series is a sort of mediation for Xu, a mediation of history, of collective memory, but also of the visual archive itself. He sources reference images for his paintings from a variety of sources. He will look sometimes to historical archives, to the internet, and even to the public. So he often puts out calls via exhibitions or online for the public to submit images from their own collections for him to paint. And while he paints well-known historical figures, for example, the leftist party activist Jiang or Beijing as depicted here, he also paints people who are less well-known or not at all, except only to their family and friends, and an insistence on the experience of the grassroots and the everyday as a constitutive part of the historical. To Xu, each portrait is a synecdoche of a greater historical narrative, a part that stands for an imagined totality of history. He draws from the historical and documentary power of the archival source image, and he's insisted in interviews that his portrait series constitute an attempt to resist amnesia or resist forgetting, whether that's the experience of the Cultural Revolution or the, quote, second revolution of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms. The scholar Margaret Hillenbrand calls this Xu's memory work. So he engenders a consciousness of the lived experience of the past through a portraiture that's often as still and monumental as a tombstone. I want to close my remarks today by just making a few comments on some of the new works that Xu shared with us during our visit today. So one thing that I was immediately interested in was in the abstract paintings that Xu's been working on during the pandemic. These are the comparatively smaller canvases that are divided between black and white that he shared with us. And I find these really interesting because for a painter who spent nearly the entirety of his career depicting mostly human subjects, Xu's abstract canvases represent a really significant break in his practice. In conversations with us, he's shared that he began making these paintings in January, which was just as Chinese citizens were suffering from the outbreak of novel coronavirus. I think it's no accident that it's the experience of pandemic that's catalyzed such a decisive break in Xu's works. For non-American citizens who are living in the United States, the experience of quarantine has also been an experience of exile. And Chinese citizens in particular find themselves stranded in the US, afraid to stay but unable to leave as every level of the US government has catastrophically floundered in its response to the crisis. We are all cut off from the ways of living, of working, and of moving to which we're accustomed. And this has the effect of making the future itself seem to be suspended. So our relationship with time itself seems to be a bit different during this period. And some people are calling this the eternal present of COVID-19. In his career, Xu's been most captivated by the relationship that portraiture imagines between individuals and collective experiences. And although we're very cognizant right now of the fact that we are living through historic times, it seems very fitting that for this moment, Xu has delved into abstraction as a suspension of the historical that mirrors the suspension of temporality under the present conditions of crisis. And to me, his exploration of abstraction resonates with the collective experience of time itself under COVID-19, caught as we all are somewhere in between health and sickness, black and white, suspended futures, and the eternal present. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angie. That was great to connect, his sort of newer body of work with the current sort of situation that surround us. So thank you. So we'd like to move on to a presentation by Lihong. So Lihong, can you unmute and start your presentation?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nats and Carol, for having me, and thank Angie for this very informative comment on Xu's career and biography, as well as his artistic choices. What I'm going to do in the next is to look at a few works closely, and hopefully we can launch a discussion from there. So I'm going to share my slides. The 90s witnessed a rise of human body-centered artistic expression in China, turning from robust political reflections to personal sensibilities. Portraits became a prominent subject matter among many artists. It was during this time Xu Weixin's work arrived at a turning point. After his early works depicting groups of ethnic minorities, in 1999, Xu Weixin accomplished this triptych titled Sour Rain. This piece was exhibited in the 9th National Exhibition of Fine Arts, which is the official exhibition organized by Chinese government and the Artists Association. In this painting, Xu Weixin turned his acumen to social and environmental realities. He depicted a crowd of urban people who appear to stand in an outdoor space together, wearing raincoats or holding umbrellas. They gaze at the viewer, inducing the viewer to confront and commiserate with their subtle expressions of anxiety. They're trapped in the elusive atmosphere, immersed in the sour rain. This painting is a unique demonstration of how she uses portraits to reflect environmental problems and how facial expressions mediate human emotions and people's response to the world. The carefully modulated colors of yellow, green, silver, blue, and ochre render the poisonous contact between the human bodies and the sour rain, which is caused by pollution due to the accelerated industrialization and the economic boom at the turn of the 21st century. On the artistic level, this piece also shows dexterity of composition. Each of the 3 parts establishes a self-contained image. The 2 panels on the 2 sides were added later as extensions of the centerpiece. But together they constitute a holistic scene centered on the man wearing glasses, highlighted in the middle. He seems to be educated and young and has nowhere to escape. These compositional strategies, while achieving a sense of balance and concentration, reflect Xu's training and practice in the academy style, a style that had a long tradition in China since the 1920s and soon developed prominently alongside socialist realism. So actually I need to switch. I need to switch a PowerPoint. This is what I should do with. Acclaimed as a realist painter, Xu Weixin makes the button ring of the society visible and remembered. This is an example of his 2005 piece, in which he displays the livelihood of migrant workers who leave their hometown to work in urban construction sites or industrial fields. This carefully composed painting shows a choreography of numerous migrant workers as a group, conducting various tasks in different postures. The laborers' bodily presence and their agitated facial expressions, the dirt on their clothing, along with their tools, create a lively scene that shows the livelihood and the energy of the subaltern people who are essential for building the infrastructure of the country. Around the same time, since 2004, Xu Weixin started to paint a series of large-scale portraits of individual coal miners. They're mostly migrant workers working in the mines under precarious, if not dangerous, conditions. Having done extensive field work living with those coal miners, the artist makes the physically and socially obscured coal miners visible in an impressive scale. He identifies their names in the titles of the paintings. He depicts coal miners in what I call a verist style. Verism is a version of realism, it tends to capture the true appearances and the true emotions of the subjects without idealizing or codifying such emotions and appearances with ideological attitude. In this portrait of a commander, Liu Xiangcai, for example, we are confronted by this individual as if we meet him in real life. His physiognomy is singular. His eyes seem inert. He's not present with us because he's completely exhausted. In fact, the viewer is overwhelmed by his blunt appearance of exhaustion and withdrawal. Still, being good with people, but in another style, Xu Weixin painted a series of large-scale portraits of real people who lived through the Cultural Revolution, which transpired in the period from 1966 to 1976. This series of black and white portraits depicts various images of people on all sides that represent the Cultural Revolution period, including workers, peasants, and the political leaders. Unlike the Commander series, which collects any individual workers, this series selects figures representative of the period of time. This is an image showing the artist working on one of the portraits. For example, this is a gigantic portrait of the peasant whose name is Chen Yonggui. Although Chen was a peasant, he is remembered as an important figure of the time because he led his village to reform agricultural production and was awarded as a model laborer by the party. In order to conjure this historical memory, Xu Weixin utilized the published photographs as his blueprints in the series. This series of photorealist portraits imposingly brings into sight the various actors of the tumultuous historical time that should not be forgotten. In the quest for historical memory, in recent years, Xu Weixin painted a series of what we have heard, 70 portraits depicting prominent figures who rose to the public sight since the Chinese reform and the opening up period. The project was finished in 2018, so the series covers the time period from 1978 to 2018. This image shows the portrait of Deng Xiaoping, for example, who is the ultimate leader of Chinese economic reform. Still adopting a photorealist approach, this series seems to have reflected the influence of mass media, which began to reshape people's lifestyle since the 80s. It also shows the openness of Chinese society with international interactions. For instance, this series includes figures like Yao Ming, the basketball player, Deng Lijun, the famous Taiwanese singer, and Ma Yun, the e-commerce tycoon. These portraits encompass an enormous constellation of familiar faces in the domains of politics, commerce, sports, entertainment, and media. As a whole, Xu Weixin's works seems to bear the mission of intense engagement with history, society, and more importantly, people. The seriality of his creative projects also gives the viewer an impression of expansiveness and diversity. At times, he takes a critical standing in selecting or representing the individual figures, but he often manages to attain a balanced perspective between the mainstream and the marginal, providing a visual historiography of modern and contemporary China. His most recent portrait painting, as we have just seen, is an image of Dr. Li Wenliang, the whistleblower of the coronavirus, who tragically passed away in February due to the disease. What I'm interested in commenting on here is Xu Weixin's newer strategy of combining text and image. The portrait itself is like an icon known to many, while the text adds to his masked face an extensive recount of Dr. Li's story. Even though the text may not be legible to some, its efficacy lies in the commemorative force that fulfills the entire surface of the painting and beyond, like a tomb tablet. The words are also marks that evoke a sense of a struggle with the most profound human empathy. So that's pretty much the end of my remarks. Before I return the platform to Natsu and the audience, I would like to follow up with a question for Professor Xu. Hopefully we can discuss from there. Yihui, you probably will translate from here.
Sure, yeah.
So it's commonly understood that during the period of economic reform after the Cultural Revolution, with the rise of non-official exhibitions, etc., contemporary Chinese art entered into a new era of contemporaneity by freeing artistic creation from political ideology and a collective outlook. But some recent studies have shown that the post-Mao era persisted with a continuity of socialist aesthetics, even though in different forms. So your painting career pretty much falls into this period of time, and you were also trained in academy style, and you chose to paint figures from both the past and the present. So I just wonder if, what is your consideration in selecting both contemporary figures, such as coal miners and some non-historical figures? So do you consider that you embrace both the contemporaneity or the roughness of the everyday life during the developing period of China, while also having a selected version of history that should be remembered in the current world? I just wonder about these two dimensions of your choices of subjects. Thank you.
好，徐老师，就是刚刚刘老师有问您一个问题，他就是在说，就是改革开放以来，似乎艺术创作离政治好像被受政治的影响越来越小了，就有一些非官方的一些艺术展览开始了，但是实际上呢，现在越来越多的研究表示，改开之后呢，这个艺术形式其实还是受到了这个一些意识形态或者是政府的引导的。那您在这个改革开放40年的作品当中呢，刘老师注意到您有可以分成您画的人物大概分成2类，一类是具有当代性的，就比如说很接地气的这种小人物，像这些矿工啊、农民工啊这一些人，还有一些人呢是那种感觉是历史上的那种大人物，包括邓小平啊这些人。那您是怎么在这两种不同的阶级或者是不同的人物身份当中做出一种平衡的？
是这样的，因为那个可以听到吗？
可以。
就是因为这个观念是我从画这个历史中国众生相1966文革那一套肖像开始的。因为中国人写历史呢，都是写帝王将相的，写大人物的。从我那一套开始呢，就是画了很多小人物，就是即兴选的。我觉得历史是不管大人物和小人物，每个人的历史，它都构成了这个宏大的历史。这个也是就是表达了我一个观念，就是历史观有关于每个人，而且人人平等，大人物小人物都是大写的人，这是我的一个观念。后来第2套呢，画了一些大人物，比方说邓小平啊什么的，也画了一些小人物。这些小人物是就是跟那个前面的那个作品是一样的道理，就是说小人物他实际上也记载了这个历史的这个印记和他有记载历史的这个功能。另外刚才前面讲的还有什么问题？
就是这个政府或者是政治。
对，我觉得现在其实改革开放40年前半期呢，就是在1980年代初的时候呢，政府对这个艺术形式还是比较介意的，因为我记得当年现在在中国有些出名的艺术家，当时就是艺术形式的变化学了西方的而受到这个就是批评。受到这个打压，但是后来呢，我觉得这个政府呢很聪明，它不断的就扩大这个外延，它就现在像当年的这个很有名的一些艺术家，在圆明园的或者在宋庄的，当时受批判的，现在已经成为 这个中国艺术的主流了。完全，我觉得政府现在不在乎你的艺术形式，而是在乎你的内容。如果你的内容有问题的话，那是不可以的。但形式你随便怎么搞都可以。现在变化很大的，我觉得这个政府是非常的这个聪明。
好。So there are basically two parts of Professor Liu's question. So I'll address each part one time. So first of all, about these combined like historical figures and contemporary sort of petty, quote unquote, petty figures. It's because I started my this project to use figure portraits to sort of take a record or document the modern Chinese history. I started this project by painting some figures from the Cultural Revolution in 1966. And because China has this tradition or historical tradition that believe that history is made by big people, by heroes, yet I believe that every single human being, individuals should have equal contribution to the history or historical development. That's why I would like to give due recognition to these sort of previously ignored individuals in the history. That's why I painted both sort of those influential people and also as well as such petty people as those miners and peasant workers. And the second part, in terms of the government control over art, I think in early 1980s, the government was very careful about the forms of art forms that artists practiced, and they did not like artists who use sort of very Western art forms in their works. So they sort of they had a very strict policy and censored a lot of artists' experimental works, experiments with artistic forms at that time. However, they became sort of opened up, more and more open-minded a little later. And nowadays, they actually do not care that much about the form. So what they really care is the content, like what you painted, what you did in your work. So a lot of artists who were censored or oppressed in 1980 actually became has become the mainstream nowadays in the art field in China. 好，
我补充一下，就是刚才我说的，在1980年代初的时候被批判的那些艺术家，现在文化部已经成立了一个当代艺术研究院，比方说像方力钧啊、张小刚啊，这些人当年都是受批判的人，现在已经在政府组织的这个政府还发工资，可能在这个中国艺术研究院下面成立了一个中国当代艺术研究院，已经把所有的这个当代艺术画家都给养起来了，就是正好佐证了我刚才讲的，现在就是当代艺术已经政府不在乎你的艺术形式。好的。
So one point to add is that now, just to add on what I had just mentioned about why, how the government nowadays really no longer cares about the artistic forms, is that there's a recently formed Academy of Contemporary Art in China, and sort of led by the Ministry of Art and Culture and Education, Art and Culture in China. They sort of hired or employed such a well-known and yet oppressed artists, contemporary art artists, as Fang Lijun, Zhang Xiaogang into this institution. And so these people become recognized by the government, even though they were oppressed in 1980s. 好了。
Thank you so much. Angie, do you have questions to Professor Xu?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Professor Xu to share with us a little bit about how the experience of not being able to leave New York has been for him and how it's affected his practice. He's told us before that he's unable to, go to Beijing, and he has a studio there, so he's quite cut off from that aspect of managing his work. But I'm also wondering, as someone who takes kind of like Chinese stories, like that's the title of one of his exhibitions, you know, takes figures as representatives of Chinese history. If the experience of exile or quarantine has changed his relationship to China at all too.
徐教授 ，Angie 的问题是说，您现在因为也是被困在纽约嘛，所以他就是想问一下，这个行动上面，一个是回不了北京，还有一个就是，其实就是整个的这个行动的能力受到限制，在您的这个对您的工作或者创作上面有没有一些改变？然后您有一个作品叫《中国故事》，里面是用人物来代表历史的。那现在这个新的这个疫情的这个环境下，是您对这个人物和历史的关系是不是有了新的看法呢？
我现在对，就是我已经有很长时间没有回去了。我觉得也有人问我是不是就是说我在纽约长期这样不回中国，会不会能够融入美国的这个当代艺术？我后来我觉得不可能，因为什么呢？因为我的大部分的这个就是说接地气是接中国的这个地气。所以我其实现在我还有一些任务没完成，就是我准备用那个肖像来表达，就是来再现中国近现代史，还有一些任务没有完成。那现在困在这里呢，我倒觉得也有个好处，就是说这边的表达我觉得相对自由一些。也许你比方说我在北京有一些肖像不可以展出的，那我在这边我也可以，说不定我就可以展出。应该创作的自由应该跟过去相比的话已经大了很多了。这是一个。第二个呢，关于疫情这个事情啊，现在我们还处在疫情当中，这是迅雷不及掩耳之势发生的事情，刚刚过去的也就半年，我现在还没有这个想好到底用什么样的一个方式来表达这个就是波及全球的这个灾难，然后用什么样的观点和用什么样的方式来表达它，我现在还没有想好，我想可能还要沉淀一段时间。
好。So for Angie, your two questions. First, I think people had asked me here that whether or not, because I'm staying here, I'm staying in New York for a long time, whether or not I would be able to sort of become part of this contemporary art in the community of the contemporary art in the US. And I have thought about this question, and to me, I feel no, I won't be able to sort of become part of that community because I got my inspirations from China. It's about how I got ideas, particularly because of the Chinese context in China. Now in New York, I have some works that to be done. That there are some portraits that I haven't finished yet, so I'm working on that, on those portraits. In terms of differences between New York and Beijing, I feel indeed in New York I can I have a sort of more freedom in terms of expression, or artistic expression. There are some portraits that I may not be able, although I have created, they won't be allowed to be exhibited in Beijing, but I may found a chance to show them or exhibit them in New York. In terms of the COVID-19, I feel we are still experiencing it. It's not finished, it's not ended yet. And I haven't had a very concrete idea about how I can show this or illustrate or visualize this COVID-19 through my work. I'm still contemplating on that. I'm thinking about that, and I think it needs a lot of work to think about how to depict this global pandemic. Yeah, 好了。
谢谢。
Well, thank you. So we received many questions from the audience, and I think many people want to know what kind of actually materials that Professor Xu used for the abstract painting.
徐老师，就是现在可以请您问，就很多观众都在好奇您用了哪一些新材料去画那个？
然后材料就是因为我那个这个做这个画室啊，就是大的工程是这个装修队做的，有些小工程我也喜欢动手。你看大家看到我的工具嘛，然后我在这些 Home Depot 在美国有个很大的这个材料，这个装修材料的这个商店，里面有各种各样的东西，以前在中国都没有的，像油漆呢就不用说了，还有柏油啊，还有各种各样的这个油性的、水性的漆，这都是我以前没有接触过的。那我就接触了以后，我把那个 Home Depot 的所有的能够这些能够涂就是涂房顶啊、涂地面啊，所有的材料我都买来了，都在试，就 Home Depot， 哎。
So as you may have heard, it's from Home Depot, all kinds of material. You paint your house, your ceilings, your floors, your walls. I use all kinds of those materials.
So in relation to paintings, so one the audience asked if he's familiar with the English painter named James W. Turner. He's known for landscape paintings.
就是问您是否熟悉这个威廉特纳？
看过他的一点东西。
So I have seen a few of his paintings.
对，就是英国的那个画家。
对。So yeah, I know.
画家，对。
So I know him and I've seen some of his paintings.
Great, yeah. So I'll just read this question. How would you interpret the relationship between the written text and portrait image on the same canvas? How did you make decision about color choices and the combination of colors and black and white sections?
所以这个问题就是问您您的这个文字和肖像它们的这个关系是什么？这个您有什么就是动机在里面，以及这个您的这个在颜色的选择上有没有什么目的？包括在这个色彩和黑白这种搭配上面。
我先讲一下这个里边。开始在肖像上写字呢，就是一般来讲，这个我在美术史上没有看到过，我也想不到。只不过是有某一次在国内的一个展览呢，我展出这个历史人物啊，当地的审查部门呢就不许我展，因为我过去的肖像呢，那个肖像旁边那个简历哈，肖像的简历就贴在那个肖像旁边，但是他们让我把简历就去掉。那去掉以后呢，观众就不知道这个人是谁了。后来我就想，我说干脆你先让我去掉，我干脆写到画面上算。这样的话呢，就反而形成了一种我前所未有的一种样式，就是在感觉比较有意思啊。后来我越写越多啊，这个东西就慢慢给固定下来了。写的内容呢，就是你像我刚才好像有一个观众问我，就画那个刚才打篮球的那个美国运动员。我那个上面呢，我是纯粹是试验形式的，我是用推特上面随便摘录一些文字，就关于美国民主党和共和党他们在这个争论的一些问题，我用这个英文把它抄在上面，它是随机的，主要是要那个图像和文字的这个对比。你先讲啊，挺长的有点。对不起。
没事。So in terms of actually I had not ever seen any painter use to add text on top of the portrait, and I've never thought about that. However, there was one time that I was trying to exhibit some of the portraits I had painted in a local art museum, and the manager there asked me to remove the CVs or the brief introduction to the figures that I showed, that is shown next to the portrait. So they asked me to remove all those brief introductions, and I feel that if I remove them, how could my audience, how could my viewers know who I am painting? So I decided, in order to sort of protest, I decided to add the text onto the portrait so that it becomes part of the painting. and then it's fine to remove all those brief introductions for whatever purpose. And in terms of what I have written for this, for example, in this painting of Jeremy Xu Haoling, it was sort of still on the beginning stage of me trying to add text on top of the portrait. So I didn't write anything very concrete about Xu Haoling, Jeremy Ling, but rather I got text or tweeters from text from tweeters that focus on the debates between Democratic and Republic parties in a way that it's more about the text, the contrast between text and image rather than the content of the text. 好了。
谢谢。
Okay, and some people are quite sort of surprised to see very sort of, beautiful studio, and she's wondering if this what kind of they use. You don't live here, right? How's your studio used besides painting?
好，就是徐老师，就是那个问题，就是问您这个工作坊看起来就是好像
很干净。
对对对，所以
对。是这样的，这个工作室呢，其实还有一个部分，因为我的画啊，就是特别大，没有地方这个放，因为不像别人的画随便找个地方挂一挂的，我一张画就占一面很大的墙，所以呢，这个地方主要是一个。 我也搞不清楚，就像一个我这个待的地方，有一个角落是画画的，但大部分是因为我画了一辈子画嘛，我有些作品就是等于是展示出来，有个别的朋友来了以后呢，就过来坐聊聊艺术，它实际上等于是一个空间，不纯粹是一个 studio， 有点就是像沙龙，但是私人的，就是因为在这个 Queens 这个纽约这个地方啊，很少有艺术家有这样的一个空间，就是很大，完全是公益性的，就是没有这个什么，就是我要营业，我要办学没有，就是有一个空间，大家在一起可以谈艺术，我觉得这是挺好的，这样子的一个功能，所以看起来比较干净。但是我画画那个地方，还是很脏的，那个地面我最近刚刚把它涂过。 是大概这个情况，您给解释一下吧。
那您住那儿吗？您住在这里？
我不住，我就住在有3迈的一个地方，家在3迈以外的地方。
好的。So this studio has multiple functions, like sort of functions beyond being a studio. First of all, because it's my paintings are relatively big, so it took almost one entire wall to just hang one painting. So I need a really big space to hang my paintings. This is a place that I work, I paint. I work on a lot of artworks here. And in addition to that, this is also like a space for my friends to come and sit and have a tea or have a drink, have a tea, and also to have a tour in my studio to look at my works. So sort of a salon-like space. And because in Queens it's really hard. There are not too many sort of nonprofit or free space for artists to come together and chat and talk. So this is a place that also has that kind of function. That's why it looks tidy and clean. And I personally I'm not living in this place. Yeah. And also
欢迎大家各位就是提前下次来纽约就到我这儿来喝茶，这个也可以喝酒，也可以聊艺术啊。
So I welcome everyone who will visit New York in the future and come to the studio, and let's have a cup of tea or some drink. Yeah.
我这儿有厨房，还有那个功能很全，卫生间就有4个。
I have a kitchen. At least like I have 4 bathrooms, so it's a really large space.
Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, it's nice that everyone's welcome. So there's a question to Angie. So I'm going to read. Am I right in sensing some political tension in Sheng's portrayal of workers, peasants during the era of economic reform, which has ironically lowered social status of those with socialist art had previously glorified. So.
Yeah, I agree with that point. And I guess my response would be to ask Professor Xu to comment on this as well.
So comment on this, on the question about the 好，就是徐老师，这个有观众问了 Angie 一个问题，就是说，这个改革开放之后，这个您所展示的工人也好，农民也好，他们是其实他们的这个社会的这个没有享受一个很高的社会等阶级的一个待遇，他们就是在社会里面处于一个底层。对，这个但是好像在之前，就是比如说文革之前或者社会主义时期呢，其实工人农民他们应该是享有很高的这个社会待遇的，就是社会阶级待遇的。这个是不是好像有一个这个矛盾，或者是有一个这个张力在其中呢？
对，是这样的，就是在这个文革中间。当时我记得我们家邻居有一个女的，她要找对象，她要找工人。那个女的很漂亮，她不找这个大学老师，她要找工人。因为那个时候呢，我们这个中国的这个政治基础就是工农兵嘛，他们在政治上的这个待遇是很高的。文革的期间，他们比方说他们不会挨斗，他们斗别人，所以他们就感觉很光荣。但是呢，改革开放以后呢，这个经济各方面发生了巨大的变化，就是他们变成了底层。那时候已经不太讲政治了，主要讲经济发展嘛，所以说他们是非常受伤的。所以我画的这个工农兵啊，这些民工啊、矿工啊，有这个意思。这两个之间就是有很大的一个转换。当然，我在肖像当中也许这方面表达的不是很清晰，但是刚才那位教授展示的工农兵那3个肖像呢，有这方面的含义，但是看出来的人并不是很多。
So yes, that's precisely one of something that I would like to show or demonstrate through my portraits, especially through the portraits that Professor Liu has showed in her presentation. Indeed, there is a sort of drastic change of the social status of peasants and workers from pre-economic reform to the economic reform. Because previously, for example, in Cultural Revolution, social workers and peasants enjoyed relatively high social status, and so they were not suppressed, but they were not suppressed or criticized publicly in society. However, after the economic reform, the economic elements become dominant in the society, and therefore therefore peasants and workers who had relatively very limited financial sources were sort of had a much lower social status than they had during the Cultural Revolution. Yeah.
Thank you, and we are all really, very curious. We passed 15 minutes from our planned time, so I think we'll wrap up here. And we'd like to thank artist Xu Weixin and also Angie and Lihong for sharing your expertise with us. It was really wonderful. So thank you for joining us, and we will return with more exciting programs in the future. So yeah, check out and please stay safe and have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. The Carol's question 没有问next time, maybe. Thank you, Natsu. Thank you, 翻译. Thank you. Bye bye.